Matthew chapter 24 is where we'll be at today. And of course, let me remind you, because I only made it through 3 of these verses last week, really. But in the first few verses of this chapter, the disciples come to Jesus after Jesus gives the final condemnation on the system of religion of Judaism. Basically tells them, look, your house is left to you desolate. This is it. It's over. He's had his last confrontation with the Pharisees and the scribes and all of those religious leaders. And the next time that he's before them will be at the mock trial where they sentence him to death. Or, well, really, they send him to Pilate so that Pilate could sentence him to death. But it was their plan. But it says that as they departed and left Jerusalem to go to the Mount of Olives, they looked back, and I'm sure the temple would have been beautiful in the evening sun, and it says that the disciples wanted to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus told them, he said, look, verily I say unto you that there won't be one stone here left upon another that won't be thrown down. He's saying there's destruction coming to all of this. Okay, and we're going to actually look in Daniel here in a minute where this was not only foretold here by Jesus in chapter 24, but Daniel foretold it almost 500 years earlier. Okay, and it says that as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. And then, of course, as I mentioned last week, if you read the parallel passages, which is Mark 13 and Luke 21, you find out that it was James, Andrew, Peter, and John were the 4 that are asking him these questions here. And it says that they asked him this series of questions, and we want to make sure that I'm just getting this for context. They said, tell us, when shall these things be? And meaning he's just been talking about the fact that the destruction of the temple is coming. But then they go on and they say, and what shall be the sign of thy coming? He's already told them, I'm going away. I'm going and I'll come back again and receive you unto myself. All those verses have already been said. But they said, what shall be the sign of thy coming? And then the follow-up is, and of the end of the world. So Matthew chapter 24 deals with all 3 as the answer to their question. They ask him, when are these things going to be? What's the deal with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem? And I think this is where most of this goes, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And so the largest chunk of Matthew chapter 24 deals with those last 2 of that 3-part question, which is, what's the sign of your coming and the end of the world? Now, I don't want to discount the fact that there's part of that question, when shall these things be? And there will be a destruction of Jerusalem. There will be a destruction of the temple. But for us, looking from our perspective, those things have passed. That happened in 70 A.D. Roman General Titus at the time, later became emperor, went in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, killed as many of the Jews as he possibly could, scattered the rest of them throughout all the world. And they ceased to be a nation until 1948. They did not possess any land in that area until 1948. So that's a long time to be judged, but that's exactly what happened. And of course, and I think they're correct. It's not a direct prophecy, but it is the components coming together for biblical prophecy to be able to be carried out when Israel was given back their nation in 1948. Because for 1900 years, basically, everybody was trying to figure out, well, how does this end time stuff work? Because there's no nation of Israel, and there's supposed to be a temple, there's supposed to be a nation, maybe the church replaced Israel, and they tried to explain how the church is the same as Israel, and that all the promises passed to the church instead of it. Just give God time, He'll work it out, and lo and behold, Israel is now a nation. And they're still fighting, and there's still war over there. And we'll look at that today, because every bit of that was foretold. Every bit of it was given as prophecy, and it's all playing out exactly like the Bible said. And you say, well, yeah, but there's no temple over there right now. Well, I'm telling you the same thing that you would tell them that were before 1948, saying, well, there's no nation of Israel. How's this ever going to work? Just give it time. They'll build that temple. Trust me. They're itching and scratching to build it now. They've got all the components together. All they need is the ability to build it in a place that they want to build it at, which would be the Temple Mount over there. But anyway, Jesus begins here and says, take heed that no man deceive you. So obviously, as we mentioned last week, there's going to be some deception over these things that are coming. And he goes on to say, for many shall come in my name and say that they are Christ, and they'll deceive many. And of course, there is in fact that component that was there. And as I mentioned last week, it's not just people saying that they're in fact Jesus, but it's also, you can lump all of the false teachers that point to different Christs and different gods and different things like that. And again, I'm trying to hurry to get to where we're headed because y'all took so long with homework. And he says, and you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. And of course, what are we hearing about even today? And today is not new. It's been happening ever since then. There has never been a time where there was quote unquote peace on earth. There's been some war, some skirmish. World War I was called what? The war to end all wars. Okay, now 20 years later, guess what they were fighting? World War II. Okay, and that one didn't end it all either. We went immediately from that into the Cold War, and that's just us. Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Russia, everyone's been, and they're still fighting. Again, rumors and wars all around the world. They're fighting in Israel right now, in Gaza. They're fighting in the Ukraine, Crimea, as well as dozens of other minor skirmishes where they shoot and kill each other on a daily basis, all because of who knows what. But anyway, the idea being that this is undeniable that this has played out. Okay? And remember at the time that he's writing it, when he says that there'll be wars and rumors of wars, see that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So this is just things that go on in the meantime. Okay? And it's one of the keys that we need to look at and realize, okay? Because the disciples didn't even really grasp it immediately. Okay? Jesus is trying to kind of let on to the fact here that there's going to be some time pass. Okay? The disciples somewhat thought that all of this might be accomplished in their lifetime. The reality is it's been almost 2,000 years now. And I think this right here, if you read this passage, you start to see that there is some time that goes by just from verses like this where he says, you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. That gives me the impression of a time frame right there. And so he says, he goes on and continues, for nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in diverse, and this means different places. And a lot of times people read that and they say earthquakes in diverse places. The in diverse places is tied to all of those things in that statement. The wars, the famines, the pestilence, and the earthquake. And again, what do we see around the world still? All of these things have gone on since the time of Jesus Christ. And I do think that as we grow towards the end time events, and I think personally that we're really close to that. I think that the players are all in place, the elements of it are all in place, and I'm not one of those that's going to tell you that it's going to be September the 27th of whatever year. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying these things were written so that we could know and understand and discern the times. No man knoweth the day nor the hour, but that's where he drew the line at. Day and hour. Okay, we've somewhat blown that out of proportion and basically said, well, we can't even know down to a set period. No, he said day and hour. There's a lot of clues that will clue us in and let us know that these events are coming to pass. Okay, and it says that all these things, and this is verse 8 here, he says all of these. Now this is harsh reality right here. All of these are the beginning of sorrows. This is just the beginning. Okay? So what happened in 70 AD, which I think fits in the context of all of this, where the original temple is going to be destroyed. I say the original, now not Solomon's, the rebuilt temple that was there in Jerusalem when Jesus is saying this, the second temple. There's yet to be a third, but there will be. And we'll try to get to that today. But just understand that all of that and everything we have experienced in our life is just what's known as the beginning of sorrows. And the reason that I say that I think these things all ramp up and become worse are by this verse right here where it says this is just the beginning of sorrows. What does that lead me to believe? That there's more sorrow and a greater compounding sorrow to come after this, as well as we have verses from the New Testament, from the Pauline epistles, that tell us things like evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. For in the last days perilous times shall come.
Where is it? 2 Corinthians?
No, that's Timothy. Yeah, 2 Timothy. But anyway, just understand, Paul was trying to let people know. Paul was trying to he told the Thessalonian church the same thing. Just understand, these things grow to a culmination event. And we're really fixing to delve into that. And now, understand, I could spend the rest of my life in this chapter. I mean, I'm just being honest, because there are so many things that are here. And so I ask you to do this, and I normally don't, but hear what I'm going to say. I want you to just trust me for the fact that chapter 24 in the book of Matthew deals with end time events. Okay? And the reason I say that is because, yes, there's the preterist view that says everything in Matthew chapter 24 happened in 70 AD. I know. I think it's easily disproven. And you say, well, yeah, but maybe all of this stuff has happened in the course. Just biblical scholars that are far smarter than me have spent years and years and years poring over the scriptures and come to the same conclusion that I have. And we could go to every one of the minor prophets. We could read all of those. We could study all of those. We could study the book of Daniel. We could go to Revelation. We could put it all together. And it would take years and years and years. But my object at this point in time is to study the book of Matthew. And so the only reason I'm asking you to do that, and you are obviously more than welcome to read any and all of that, is that I don't want to take an exorbitant amount of time to give you every one of those background pieces to get you to the point where you say, okay, yes, I see you have fully shown and proven that this is about the end time events. I'm just asking you to take my word for that, with a grain of salt, as always, that you absolutely have the ability to go and read and to study on your own, and I think you'll come to the same conclusion that I have. So I normally don't ask you that, but I just know how much there is in the background of this chapter. But Jesus is asking the disciples, or answering the disciples' questions. Namely, and like I say, I think the lion's share of chapter 24 is devoted to the last 2/3 of their question, which is, when are you coming, and what is the sign of your coming? Okay, and so he's already told them that these things, the wars, the rumors of wars, the nation that shall rise against nation, and again, that's why I say these things go beyond the scope of just what happened in Jerusalem in 70 AD. This is worldwide that he's talking about here when he says nation shall rise against nation. At that point in time, there wasn't but one nation, Rome. They had conquered the known world. How were anybody to know that there would be over 200 nations, sovereign nations, by the time we get to now in the end times? Okay? And so just understand when he says nation shall rise against nation and there shall be famines, pestilence, and earthquakes in diverse places, that's what we're seeing in our lifetimes. That's what our parents and our grandparents and all of the previous generations, that's what everyone is seeing. As Rome crumbled, nations diversified all over the face of the earth, and there's been an explosion of that. And as soon as all of those nations developed, they started fighting each other. It's just the truth. And everything that Jesus said here played out perfectly. Again, as I mentioned 100 times before, it's not because he's good at guessing. He's seen the future. He's writing an eyewitness account. He's already seen what's going to happen. He knows full well what's going to happen. And so he says here that all of these are the beginning of sorrows. And in verse 9 he says, then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. So this is in a time leading up, and I fully believe that we're headed into this time. We're already running past this beginning of sorrows, and we're headed into these verses right here. It says, then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. Okay? And you think about all of the vitriol that we see in our world today for those of different opinions. And let's face it, even sometimes we're guilty of it on our side. We forget that we're not supposed to hate those other people. Okay? I get that what they stand for is wrong. I get that what they're doing is wrong. And it's not wrong to hate the evil, and it's not wrong to hate the sin, but it is wrong to hate other people. Okay? And we sometimes, we elephants sometimes have a hard time separating the two. Okay? And so just remember, it says that many will betray one another and shall hate one another. And I think this has even a further implication than just what we see today. As I say, I think this is we're just headed into this time period. And it says that many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. And now there's always been false prophets. There was false prophets in the New Testament church age that Paul wrote about, that Peter wrote about, that Jude wrote about, that John wrote about. John wrote about in his 3 epistles that the spirit of Antichrist had already come and that there were many Antichrists already. Now the Antichrist is not here yet, but there's already been anybody that is against Christ is Antichrist, and so
Or little a of Antichrist.
exactly. And so just understand that many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many, and we've never seen an era where as much of that is going on as is now. There are so many divisions and problems, and we see it even on the forefront in what supposedly mainstream Christianity today, where they're arguing over, should we let women be in the ministry? Should we allow, those with alternative lifestyles? And the arguments are all centered around the arguments, think about this now. The arguments are all centered around the fact, well, popular opinion says this, the culture says this, the thinking of our day says this. You hear nothing in those conversations about the Word of God says this.
Yeah, there's no question about popular opinion or today's
Exactly.
wants or whatever. It's not about that. That shouldn't be in the consideration in the slightest.
Exactly. But it is.
It is.
And they've all got their explanation for why it's okay. And they're all, in the end, leading everybody astray. Because these are not even the important questions. If you're that wishy-washy on who needs to be in the ministry, who needs to be part of the church, who is part of the church, where are you at on the real gospel of Jesus Christ? They're mostly in the same state. They can't even really articulate it very well anymore. And so just understand, there's going to be many false prophets that shall arise and shall deceive many. And then obviously beyond that, you've got even the more fringe that are becoming ever more popular with the I've had a dream and a vision, and the Lord showed me that this is fixing to happen, and the Lord showed me how that, this thing that happened in the news this week, this is prophetic, and this has to do with this thing, and none of it's in Scripture. Or they're tying it so loosely to Scripture. The idea being that by the time we get to these end time events that play out, there's going to be so much deception, okay, that nobody's really going to know. And when I say nobody, I'm talking about the lost world. And under that banner of the lost world falls all the false Christians and the false religion of Christianity, unfortunately, but it's just the truth. But by the time you get to that point, there will be so much deception in the world that when not Christ, but Antichrist shows up, and I'm talking about the Antichrist, everybody in the world is going to turn to that individual, think that it's the Lord Jesus Christ, and worship Him. And it's completely and totally backwards to everything that the real Jesus Christ was.
A lot of tares.
Exactly. The whole entire world, and we forget this sometimes. I've tried to remind people as often as I could. The whole entire world does not end in atheism. The whole entire world ends in a one-world religion that worships, the Bible says, the beast and his image. And that one-world religious system is so big and so powerful that it not only controls the religious system of the world, it controls the governmental system of the world, and it controls the monetary system of the world. That's a lot of power in one place and in one individual, but that's where it all ends. Yeah, and then after the Antichrist, then the real Christ comes in. And that's when everything changed. But just understand, that's where Jesus is pointing the disciples. He says, look, there's going to be many false prophets that shall arise and shall deceive many. And in verse 12 he says that because, I should have advanced the slides before now. He says that because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. Because iniquity, because evil, because sin, because wrong will abound. It will be in massive display and quantity. It says, because of all of these things, the love of many shall wax cold. The care, the compassion, and exactly. And again, I point you to this day. Look at where. And I hate to always go to politics. It's in everything. It's really in everything. Drive down the road for a few hours and look at how many people get mad at each other. Okay?
Well, one example of that, love of many shall wax cold, all the school shootings and stuff like that. Just think about even ourselves. I know myself. You hear about it on the news, like, oh man, that's bad. You go about your day.
Yeah.
There's no like, oh my goodness.
We've become so desensitized to it that it doesn't even really register anymore. Okay? And exactly, that's a good case in point. Okay? Before Columbine, which I'm thinking was late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere in that. Somewhere in that.
1999.
That would be late 1900. But anyway, late 90s. Okay, 1999. Before that, in the previous almost 200 years of this country, how many school shootings do you think there were?
There was one in the 1960s. It happened somewhere in Texas.
Right.
But-
The guy wasn't right in his mind. He had some kind of a tumor in his brain and
Yeah, exactly. Okay. But my point is, okay, the things that normally went on in school that got you in trouble, especially let's go back to pre-1960, 70, somewhere in that range. Okay. Before that, the things that went on primarily in school that got you in trouble was sticking gum under the seat, shooting spitballs at somebody, that kind of thing. You think about what goes on in school right now. Okay? And since Columbine in the 90s, how many school shootings have we had? I don't even know anymore. Okay? And yeah, Aaron's right. It's to the point where it's like, oh man, that's horrible.
Okay.
We move on. We're callous. We don't understand anymore. And y'all go ahead and get ready to be mad at me. Okay?
I already am.
I know. Okay? I think a large part of that is due to the fact that we are constantly bombarded with all of that stuff, meaning we put it in movies, we put it in music, we put it in video games, we put it in all of these forms of entertainment, and then we consume it constantly. And it is why people eventually, and you say, oh, well, you can't blame it on that. And I understand that there's other factors at play, but I'm saying you can't see that stuff constantly and not be affected by it. Okay?
Even if it's a not real instance, it can, because you're going through the same screen and seeing it, and it can kind of just get, it just gets harder and harder to kind of separate what's real and what's not in the, it's all coming through your phone screen, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You see all the school shootings and all that, and like you said, you hear the music, it just all kind of makes it harder to care.
Mm-hmm.
Which you're right.
And then when things happen like that, a lot of people put that person's name out there. So they're getting the recognition.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
not recognition, but they are.
Mm-hmm.
Not the victims. So everybody's like, oh, look, I can be famous for.
Yeah, and there's many factors at play, but all I'm saying is you can't constantly consume that and not be affected by it. And the lie, and you say, well, I can do it and it doesn't bother me. I beg to differ. I really beg to differ. I think you don't understand how affected by it you really are. And again, it's why you can watch that and it doesn't even bother you anymore. You can watch, and I'm not even talking about the really, really explicit stuff. I mean, I'm just talking about mainstream Hollywood. You can watch a war movie or a documentary or something like that. And you can sit there and just watch person after person being killed and slaughtered and blown away. And because you're thinking, well, it's just a movie in your mind, it doesn't even really move you anymore. Okay? And there becomes a point where, and I think the idea here and the reason and the plot behind all of this is to desensitize people to the fact that these things are actually going to begin to play out. Okay? And he says, because iniquity shall abound, because evil will abound and be so prevalent that the love of many will wax cold. And in verse 13 he says, but he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. Now I think we need to clarify some things here, okay? Because in our Southern Baptist vernacular, every time we read the word saved, we go to one thing and one thing only, okay? We need to be careful here, because this verse is not saying that simply by enduring hard times and going through hard things, we receive eternal life as the reward. Jesus is simply saying those that endure all of these events to the end, there is salvation coming to the earth. Okay? It is not speaking here, I don't believe, of individual salvation, because again, we do not receive salvation by enduring. That's not how we receive the salvation that we would normally say, well, he got saved.
Yeah.
I understand that. But the Bible used the word just like we would. If I say, yes, so-and-so was in a car crash, but EMS got there and they saved him. That word has different meanings, and this is one of those instances. So, yeah, we have tended to put that word saved in a little box and say that every time, just because it's in the Bible, that's the only thing that it's talking about here. Okay? But it has different applications and different meaning. And I think from the context of this scripture here, we see Jesus is not simply talking about the fact that if you'll just endure all of this, you'll be saved in the sense of eternal salvation here. This is that there is an end to these events and a salvation from these events that will be experienced by a particular group of people in these events. Okay? So just to understand, that's I know that's a lot, and we're moving on. Okay? And in verse 14, he says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." Now, at the time that Jesus wrote this, and this is another reason that I say these events were not culminated in AD 70. Okay? At the time of AD 70, the gospel of the kingdom had not been preached in all the world. And truth be told, at this point in time right now, when you and I sit here, the gospel of the kingdom has still not been preached to every nation in all of the world. There are still random places around the world where nobody has ever touched with the gospel. And I think as we draw near to these events and to the end of these events, as all of this comes to pass, that we will get to a point where it will in fact be preached to all the world. And in fact, in Revelation, we see that there's an angel that preaches the everlasting gospel from the heavens. So there is a lot that ties into this verse. And again, I wish I had more time to devote here, but I'm trying to get through a few more. I'm not even going to hardly make it to Daniel today. We're trying here. This leads up to it. In verse 15 right here, he says, hold on, I missed it. In verse 15 he says, "When ye therefore shall see." Okay? Y'all get that? He's talking to the disciples in about AD 28 to 30, somewhere in that neighborhood. Okay? Is what he's saying, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation. Is he talking about something that's already happened, or is he talking about something that's going to happen in the future? Yeah. He's obviously talking about a future event. Okay? Because the preterists say that this event right here that he's describing, the abomination of desolation, was done by Antiochus Epiphanes in about 165 BC. Jesus is here talking about it like it's still a future event. But the preterists say, no, that was Antiochus Epiphanes. He offered a pig on the altar to Zeus in the temple. That's where you get the Maccabees that came in, cleansed the temple. Yeah, lit the lamps, only had enough oil for a little while, and they burned instead for 8 nights. But anyway, that's where you get the Jewish tradition of Hanukkah. Antiochus Epiphanes might have been a picture, might have been a type, might have been a glimpse of what the Antichrist might be like what he was going to do, but it was not the event that Jesus is talking about right here, because he is still describing this event as being a future event. Exactly, a foreshadowing, a type, any of those words work just fine. He says, "When you shall therefore see." Now who's he talking to? The disciples. Okay? Now I'm going to go ahead and start setting some stuff up here. Okay? Because there are a lot of people who say, now look, everything in Matthew 24 that Jesus is telling the disciples about, this is only for the Jews. He's talking to the disciples. Now I understand they were of Jewish nationality, but they don't represent the Jews. The disciples are going to go on to be Christians.
Yeah.
They're gonna always be dealt with as Christians. The disciples are never dealt with as only being Jews. So just understand, he says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Okay? Jesus is talking about a specific event, and this is where we were trying to get to. I got a few minutes. We're going to look at a chapter or a verse or two in Daniel, try to set it up. We'll finish this thought next week. But he tells these disciples, he says, look, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So the event he is referring to is a specific event that apparently Daniel the prophet spoke about. Agree?
Yeah.
Okay. So he says, stand in the holy place, which to everybody at that time, the holy place would be the temple in Jerusalem. Okay. Whoso readeth, let him understand. So whoever reads this should understand that this is an event, and this, again, as I mentioned, this has to do with chronology. Okay? This has to do with the chronology of the end time events, because this event is tied in with Daniel's prophecy, and then it's tied in the book of Revelation, and it is tied to a specific period of time, and it is tied to a specific number of days within that period of time. So this is not random spiritualized. This is specific individual events that he is talking about here. So he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, meaning, now think about this. Jesus is saying this to his disciples. Nobody's written this down yet. It's amazing the foreknowledge that Jesus has. But here it is written down. And now, whoso readeth, let him understand. That's still the call. So you and I are reading it. Whoso reads it, let him understand. We can understand what Jesus is saying even today when he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And you say, well, what is the abomination of desolation? You've said it 14 times and you still hadn't told me what it is. Well, let's look real quick, because y'all are running me out of time fast. In the book of Daniel, and these were from the chapters that I told you to read. And just understand that Daniel is in Babylon. Okay? Daniel, along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, have been carried off along with thousands of other of the young men and the women and the children from the nation of Israel, because Babylon came in, sieged the city of Jerusalem for quite some time, and then completely and utterly destroyed and ransacked the entire city, took them captive, killed the king and his sons. You can read about all of that over in the Old Testament and the Chronicles and in several other places, but basically killed the king, killed his sons first, and then put his eyes out. They said, the last thing you'll see is us kill your son. And then killed the king. And took Daniel as well as all of those other young men and many captives into captivity, destroyed Jerusalem, just destroyed Solomon's temple. Okay? Daniel is sitting in Babylon as the king's cupbearer, or as one of the young men that is aid to the king, at least. Nehemiah was the cupbearer, excuse me. But he's sitting in Babylon. There's no Jerusalem. There's no temple. There's no nation of Israel. Okay? And he is fixing to talk about things that are going to happen in the next 100 years, as well as things that are going to happen in the next 500 years, as well as things that are going to happen way beyond that at the end of time. And again, the clarity and the specificness of it is absolutely undeniable that this is God-given prophecy. Because he's fixing to foretell, and I got to leave it with this, just understand, we'll come back to it next week. He is fixing to foretell of events that happen in Jesus' time. And in the temple that Jesus is going to be present with, before there's even a temple. He talks about things in the temple, and he's sitting in Babylon, and there is no temple. There is no Jerusalem. It's all been destroyed, and he's writing about things that are going to happen in Jerusalem, things that are going to happen in the temple. He's even going to talk about the fact that there's going to be a commandment to go forth and to rebuild and to restore Jerusalem, the wall, and to rebuild the temple. None of those things have been done, and none of that has happened. None of those orders have been given. He's sitting in captivity in Babylon. And yet we'll read about in Nehemiah and in Esther, as the command is in fact given by King Artaxerxes. Who would have thought a pagan king would have told Nehemiah, hey, go on back and rebuild the walls to the city of Jerusalem. If you need materials, if you need supplies, you just let me know. I'll give you anything you need. Nehemiah went back. Ezra went back. And they rebuilt the temple, they rebuilt Jerusalem, rebuilt the walls, rebuilt the streets, and Daniel foretold all of that. Who would have ever thought that they would have told them, the Jewish people, y'all can go back and you can rebuild your city and you could rebuild your temple. But yet Daniel wrote about it, and guess what? It happened just like God said it was going to happen, and they went back and they rebuilt it. And the temple that was there when Jesus and his disciples are walking here is the same temple that they went back and rebuilt. Now they later remodeled and improved it and restored it. But just understand, nobody could have pictured those things. That wasn't something you did to people you captured back then. You didn't give them money and say, here, just go back and rebuild all your stuff. But that's exactly...
Whatever you need.
Yeah, exactly. But that's exactly what happened. They were allowed to do that, and they were given that ability. And so Daniel writes about it. So I've got to be done there. But next week, I promise, we're going to look at these chapters in Daniel, and we're going to see as Daniel begins to foretell what is known in biblical prophecy as the 70 weeks. He tells him in chapter 20, or in verse 27 of chapter 9, he says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. 70 weeks, and 69 of those weeks play out between the time that the order is given to rebuild and restore Jerusalem until the time that Messiah the Prince is cut off. And that term in the Bible, cut off, means to kill. Mm-hmm. So Daniel foretells of 69 weeks from the time that the order is given to rebuild and restore Jerusalem. Again, there was no order. There was no even thought of how that could possibly be conceived or happen at that point in time. But he's foretelling about a time that there'll be an order given to restore and rebuild. To Messiah the Prince being cut off will be 69 weeks. And then there's going to be another week. And that's really what happens here in Matthew chapter 24. So I'm done. I was talking as fast as I could.